Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today I wanted to have a little discussion with you. And really, what I want to talk about is when to change or adapt your lesson plans from your albums. Now, if you're like me, you put a lot of time, a lot of sweat, and a lot of tears into your albums. And you get very attached to your albums. And that's a good thing. It's good for you to have this love for your lessons, to have a love for the theory, to have a love for that training that you went through, because that was a lot of hard work and it was a lot of stress, and you came out of it and you passed. And it is a joy to look at these albums and remember all the work that you put into them. But I think it's important to remember that when you're going through AMI training, you are training for the perfect classroom. You are training for the perfect child. In fact, I remember when we were getting ready for exams, my trainer said that, when you're going through your exams and you're getting out a material and you're presenting it to your examiners, you are going to present it as though you are presenting it to the perfect child. And that really sums up what your training is all about. Your Montessori training is for the perfect environment, the ideal environment, and the perfect child who can auto-educate. Now, after training, or even during training, if you're teaching during training, you get out into the real world and you get your first classroom and you start to realize that the ideal child, the perfect child, feels more like the exception than the norm. And when that happens, what do you do? How do you approach your lessons when you don't have the perfect environment? What do you do when your training doesn't prepare you for a situation? That's when we have to look at our environment and we have to look at ourselves and we have to look at our students and we have to make some decisions. And I'm going to walk you through what it looks like to decide whether or not you need to make some changes with your albums or with your environment or with yourself when it comes to adapting for the real world. Because if you are like a lot of Montessori teachers out there, you are probably finding that you have a lot more needs than you realized going through your Montessori training. And the reason why that is first of all, you're always going to have a percentage of children that are never going to be able to auto-educate the way that your albums are presented. You'll have a lot of children. Most of the children are going to fit into the category of being able to grasp what you're doing from your albums, but you're always going to have a percentage that struggle. And typically in public school, that's about 10 to 12% of the classroom. Now in Montessori, statistically speaking, we actually could have up to double that number. Montessori tends to have more children with special needs inside their classroom. And there are a lot of reasons why that could be, and that's partly because parents are looking for alternatives. They know that their child is behaving differently or that they're learning differently, and they're looking for something different. And so they're sacrificing a lot to keep them out of public school and put them in an environment like Montessori because they want to give them the best chance to succeed. And while this is wonderful, and I absolutely applaud parents for looking for the best for their children, it's also important to note that Montessori teachers are not special education teachers. And so there's a lot of skills that we have missing that really can still make it difficult for children to learn. Now, there's a lot of great things about Montessori that are beneficial, that can be adapted, that work really well for students who have learning disabilities and students who have physical disabilities or behavioral issues. There are a lot of things in Montessori that work, but the teacher needs to be educated on how to adapt themselves and adapt their lessons to those needs. And that does take training. So today I just want to go over 3 important points of what it looks like to adapt to the needs of your classroom and the procedure that you should follow on deciding when to change something or how to change something. Now, the first thing to look at when you're having issues in your classroom is yourself. That's the number one thing. That's the first point. That's the first rule. When something isn't working in your classroom, the first thing you look at is yourself as the guide, as the teacher. And you have to ask yourself, is there something in my training? Is there something in my experience? Is there something in my knowledge? Is there something in my attitude or my behavior that is causing a problem in the environment? Are there lessons in my album I'm not comfortable with? Are there lessons that I don't like and it's showing up in how I present them to my students? And so that's really the first thing to look at. And the second thing you need to look at, if you've looked at yourself and you've examined all of that and you're not finding anything that's really a problem there, I would say the second thing to look at is the physical environment of the classroom. Is there something in the physical environment that is causing either a distraction, a disruption, or is it just something in the physical environment that is keeping the children moving in a way or taking things off the shelf in a way that is causing a problem in the classroom? For instance, if you have the metal insets on a shelf down at the bottom where they can't see them and they're tucked behind another shelf and it's really hard for them to get to them and they can never really get to it, this might discourage children from taking that off the shelf. Now, they might not get it off the shelf because you don't show it to them. Maybe you don't like the metal insets, and so you don't present them. So there might be something going on there. But it could be that there's something going on in your physical environment that's keeping children from working with certain materials or keeping them from working with them appropriately. So take a look at your physical environment. And when you're doing this, also, I want you to take a look at your schedule, the time of day that this is happening, or a time of day when something is being used or is not being used. Also keep track of how many distractions and disruptions are happening to your classroom within your 3-hour work cycle. The 3-hour work cycle really should be respected. If you have something going on every hour or hour and a half, if you have new people coming in, new people leaving, if you have specials coming in, if you have somebody taking out students, if you have administrators that love to just come in during your 3-hour work cycle and tell you anything or something or nothing and just come in and distract people, then that's a problem. So you need to make sure that that 3-hour work cycle is respected, that that concentration is respected. But you also have to look at the physical environment and say, okay, you know what? The reason why children aren't doing the scrubbing the table work is because they can't get to that shelf or they can't pick up that tray. I have too big of a tray. I have too much on the tray. I need to break it down into smaller steps. Take a look at those physical things in your environment and see if there's something there that's causing issues for your students. Now, the third thing that you look at would be the last thing that you look at. And the last thing you look at is the student themselves. And when you're taking a look at what's going on in your classroom and wondering if you need to change something or adapt something, if you're looking at why something isn't going right, the very last thing you look at is the student themselves. You examine yourself first, then you examine the environment, and then last, you observe the student. You examine the student. And you have to ask yourself a question of whether or not what's going on is something that's affecting the entire class or just certain students. And if it's affecting the entire class, most likely it's one of the first two reasons why something isn't going well. It's either you or something in the environment. But when you start looking at individual students, why certain students might not be getting the sandpaper letters off the shelf, why they're not doing certain activities inside the classroom, why no matter how much you show them to sweep something up, they can't seem to cross that midline and the mess gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Those are things that can be individualized to certain students and could represent something that's going on with a student. Now, before you take a look at what might be happening with a learning disability or physical disability, there are two important things you need to ask yourself about the student. The first thing you need to ask yourself about your student that might be having difficulties is one, have they had any health issues lately? Has their health changed in any way lately? Because you really want to pay attention to if there's something physical going on with their body. You know, if they've just had a couple weeks where they've been struggling with a fever and a cough, yeah, that could change the way that they are interacting in the classroom. The other thing you need to look at is if the child has experienced any huge changes or any trauma lately. And when it comes to trauma and learning disabilities, trauma can look like a learning disability. It might be that the student does not have a learning disability. It could be that they're going through something traumatic. And as an educator, you aren't always aware of what a child is going through. Sometimes parents don't want to tell you what's going on in their lives. Sometimes they really don't want to tell you that they're getting a divorce or that somebody in the family has died or that there's been something going on. And parents have a right to their privacy, and you as the educator have to respect the fact that if a parent is not ready to talk to you about something that's going on in their life, you need to wait and be supportive. But at the same time, you need to also help them understand that you're seeing something that's going on in their child and you just want to get their advice and their insight on it, and build a relationship of trust so that the parents can talk to you and help build that bridge between what's going on in their life and the child's life, and of course in the classroom. So once you've looked at the child's health and whether or not they've been through a trauma, if they're experiencing something really different in their life, and you can go ahead and say, okay, those two things are not the case, then you can go ahead and start looking at, okay, is there something that's going on maybe on the autism spectrum? Is there something going on with speech that we can refer them out to speech pathology? Is there something going on in their behavior and their actions that would be beneficial if we did a referral to an occupational therapist? Can we refer them to the pediatrician so that they can get some different referrals going on there? And so that's the procedure you need to follow when you decide whether or not you need to change something in your album. First of all, maybe you need to change something in yourself, and you have to really examine yourself and be honest with yourself of whether or not you really understand or know your album or know the lesson or appreciate the lesson the way you should. The second thing you need to do is take a look at that physical environment and decide, is my dishwashing area, too messy? Are the buckets too big? Do I have too much water going into them? What about hand scrubbing? Is the bowl too small? Is the water going everywhere because they can't fit their fingers into the bowl? And so we need to look at those physical things. And we need to say, I can adapt something and change something based on the needs of my students. They can't pick up this tray. They can't balance this tray. It's breaking every day. Maybe I can do this differently. And of course, the last thing is to look at your students individually and see if there is something going on there. See if there's something that you need to change to meet a very specific need. And how do you adapt that lesson when you have children with specific needs that are different from the rest of the classroom? And that really is going to depend on what that need is. And that's why it's really important to talk to an occupational therapist or a speech pathologist or an ABA therapist to understand how this child learns best. Understand, okay, what is going on with this child that they can't get this work accomplished? An occupational therapist might look at this child and say, okay, I can see where the core strength is an issue, or the hand is an issue. And if we engage in these exercises and we strengthen the core, that this work will be more successful. Or the occupational therapist might have different activities for you to include inside your classroom that will really help the child focus or relax. So they might say, okay, we need to put in a quiet space for the student because their sensory issues are very specific to this trigger. And if we have a space laid out for them where they can go and they can put on headphones and just relax for 5 minutes, get a timer out and relax for 5 minutes, this could change their entire way of behaving inside the classroom. Or they might say, here's a great big huge space for a class gathering right here, but this student isn't ready for that. So let's make a space next to the class gathering area, and they can be a part of it, but they can also be separate, and they can gradually make their way into the whole group, but we're not going to force them into the group at the same time. We're going to give them their own space, and they're going to work towards making it to the whole group. So there's different things that an occupational therapist might suggest. A speech therapist might suggest working with the sandpaper letters differently. They might tell you as the guide to really enunciate or be very specific with these specific sounds, and you're going to emphasize maybe the s in a word. Repeat the words back to them, repeat the sounds back to them, repeat the phrases back to them, and really emphasize the areas where they're having trouble. And so they're going to give you very specific lesson plans on what type of emphasis to have in different areas. So that'll look very different than what an occupational therapist might suggest. Or if you do have a child who is on the autism spectrum, then an ABA therapist may have an entirely different method of helping you adapt your albums. And an ABA therapist can take a look at what you're doing with your albums, and your albums are already really great for an ABA therapist. They're already broken down to tiny little steps that an ABA therapist can come in and say, okay, I see what you're doing here, but what we're going to do is take this exact same lesson and do a backwards chaining model. And so the way that you approach the lesson might be shifted just a little bit, and there might be some more reinforcements added in to the lesson, such as a high five or a good job. That's not something you would do with most of your students, but maybe this student really needs that reinforcement, and that ABA therapist can suggest that for each student. Or maybe after the lesson, the child gets a toy car to play with for a few minutes. Now, that's not something you would do with a lot of your students, but that is a way that you could adapt your lesson plan to a student that has a specific need, that needs a specific reward. And behavioral rewards like that for children with autism, the way it was explained to me is that it is a control of error for their behavior. Where a lot of other students, most students don't need that reward for their behavior to understand that they're doing things right. A child with autism might need that. That lets them know that good job, that well done, that high five, that reward of the toy. That is a control of error for their behavior, saying, okay, you're on the right track. And there are certain students that are going to need that. And while that's not typical of the Montessori experience, it is something to be aware of, and it is a way that you can adapt your albums. And so when you're looking at how to adapt these lessons individually, just make sure that you're adapting it to their specific needs and that you are looking at their needs and it's not something that's your need. Because a lot of the times we make a lot of changes in the environment because we don't like something, that we want to make something easier on ourselves as the adult. And guess what? The child's job is to do the work. The child's job is to have the most work possible. But we also have to present it in a way where they are capable of it, where the isolation of difficulty is built up one by one by one, so that it keeps going up the steps to more difficult and more complicated work. And when that's not happening in a child, we do have to refer out. We do have to get resources. And the most difficult thing about this whole situation as a Montessori teacher, as a homeschool parent, is a lot of the times you feel like you're guessing. A lot of the time you feel like there's a lot of trial and error going on and you're not sure what's right. But a lot of people are expecting you to be the doctor, to be the occupational therapist, to be the speech therapist, to be the ABA therapist, to be the psychologist. And you're wearing so many different hats that you haven't had training for that it burns you out. And if you're one of those teachers that feels that way right now, that you're being asked to be an expert in all these different fields that you're not trained in, then I understand what you're going through right now. And it's really important for our administrators to get training in special education, to get training in Montessori inclusion. And it's really important if you're a homeschool parent to understand that it's okay not to have all those expectations of yourself, that it's okay to look for somebody on the outside to help you out. But just understand if there's something that's not going perfectly according to the way you were trained or to the way that your curriculum is being built, it's okay that you're not an expert in everything. It's okay to look outside of where you're at and look for help. And I think that's the most important thing we can do as Montessori educators, right? Whether you're a homeschool parent or whether or not you are in the classroom, in a Montessori classroom, in a public school Montessori classroom or private, we need more connections to occupational therapists. We need more connections to speech pathologists. We need more connections to ABA therapists. We just need more referrals. And Montessori is a little behind the ball when it comes to this inclusive training and how to build a program. A lot of administrators don't know how to build that. They don't know that they need to reach outside the school to build a program for their students that are struggling. And I want you to keep advocating for that. And if you are struggling with finding resources that can help you, if you want your administrators or if you yourself want to get extra training and have a better idea of how to help the students in your school, I would highly encourage you to go over to Montessori for Inclusion. This is the Montessori Medical Partnership for Inclusion. They have a lot of different trainings. They have a lot of different classes. So I would recommend this because I have actually taken 2 of their classes and it's been a really great support. It's really been wonderful, and there's lots of different learning sources, and I really absolutely highly recommend Barbara Laborski as the occupational therapist that they work with to teach a lot of the things that are going on in these classes. I highly recommend any talks that she has on occupational therapy and sensory needs. So that is a really, really great resource right there. So I have one friend right now that's taking the Understanding Interventions and Therapies in a Montessori Setting, and I took that class this past winter. So that is a wonderful class. I would recommend that you start here for your training if you are a teacher or if you're a homeschool parent. And then if you're an administrator, they have specific courses just for you as well. So take a look at everything they've got on this website. I hope that this is helpful. I hope this topic has been valuable to you. If you have any questions, leave them down below. I'll be happy to get back with you as soon as possible. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you've liked this video. If you have, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and like, share, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.